What if I told you that you could go beyond Brood War, that you could go to a world of RTS gameplay that few have seen before, and fewer still dare to tread? I'm talking about Cosmonarchy. I always talk about Cosmonarchy in Pr0totype. It's my solo design podcast. I'm Pronogo, and today we're going to be talking about some of Brood War's faults and foibles. Of course, I'll also be recapping some Throneroom results. That's the stage of our current premier tournament that we are running, Acropolis #1 for Cosmonarchy. Indeed, a project that goes well beyond Brood War in ways that no other RTS game has ever gone. And after that, we will be talking about some exciting new additions and content that I will be releasing or providing, or maybe have already provided to you, the player, the listener, the viewer. Of course, there's another opportunity for me to talk about the fact that we are the No Frauds Club. We are members of the No Frauds Club. You can be a member too by joining our Discord server, and you can be a very well appreciated member of our coffee page. The link at the bottom left of your screen, link in the description of the video. You know how it goes. Just pop on in there and see what you feel like doing. If you feel like donating to the cause, we will take your monthly payments or your one-time donations. It all goes to a good place. Cosmonarchy, of course. So, with all of that out of the way, the shilling is complete. I hope you guys are having a great day today, and I will be spoilering. I will mention it up front. I will be spoiling ASL number 17, season 17. So if you did not watch that tournament yet, you might want to skip to, maybe I'll provide like a no spoiler section. I'm not really much about spoiler culture. I find it to be kind of dumb. It's like, you know, if you engage with content that talks about a certain thing, and is very much linked to a certain thing, then why would you engage with that content and then, you know, be angry that you get spoiled about it or whatever? But anyway, I figure since maybe people don't expect me to always talk about ASL and stuff, it's fine to put in a note in here. But I just wanted to point that out. So yeah, go look at the description. I timestamp all of these. Check it out and see what you can do if you're not interested in listening in about the ASL 17 Afrika Star League, which I guess it will no longer be called Afrika Star League anymore. That was an interesting one. We'll see how that one goes. But let's talk about Brood War's flaws. So yes, spoilers for ASL 17. Soul Key wins it back-to-back. It's ZVZ against Hero in the finals. It goes to 7 games, and in that way, it's kind of exciting. But each game, kind of in isolation, is not very good. It's not very interesting. And I know that mirror matchups are something that a lot of players tend to feel pretty badly about. If we think about Brood War specifically, and this will be a very Brood War-focused episode when it comes to not talking about Cosmonarchy specifically, I wanted to mention that obviously the mirror matchups in there, I guess TVT is probably the most playable one, but also the one that people find the least appealing en masse because of the fact that it takes so long oftentimes, right? And the reason why I say it's the most playable is because in PvP, you can lose to build order coin flips. And actually the same thing is sort of true with ZVZ. There was even a skit where in ASL Season 17, the 2 players that were in the finals were playing rock, paper, scissors with each other. And I find that to be kind of funny because they even know, yeah, it's kind of like that, right? Like I can go 9 pool, but against your hatch first, but if you go, a 12 pool, then you're going to be ahead of me and stuff like that, right? So it's just, it can get pretty silly. Overpool gives you like 1 extra worker, so that's still playable, but still, it's like, why is it such a thin needle? And I've seen, everybody talks about how that's on a razor's edge in ZVZ and to a lesser extent PvP, but still definitely one where we don't often get classic PvP games. It takes a lot longer to get a classic ZVZ game, admittedly. So I would say ZVZ is the least playable or most volatile, least interesting, least most commonly bad matchup in terms of like viewer engagement and also I would say breadth of strategies. So as like a game designer, it's not very good. And as a viewer, it's not very good. And I would probably have a hazard a guess to say that as a player, it's not very good either. But the competitors don't really mind too much about having fun. They're here to compete. This is their career. This is their job. So it's a very different equation for them. So the reason why I wanted to mention this is because the fact that the latest and greatest tournament closed out for StarCraft 1 using a mirror matchup that is in fact the worst one, is sort of agreed upon by fans and critics and analysts and pundits, this is the worst mirror matchup, right? Nobody likes this, virtually speaking, and we can still get hyped for it insofar as it's true greatness, as far as this is the best Zerg player, so on and so forth, and this is the best player maybe, period. There definitely was some interesting finishes. For example, Sharp going all the way to the round of 4, as it's called, the semifinals, as we would say in more Western parlance. And I think that's definitely interesting. He showed some pretty good games despite not being able to pick up more than one win. But that's still something where you look at that and you think, oh, damn, okay. Well, I guess we have this mirror matchup. The fact that ASL, the premier StarCraft 1 tournament, had the worst matchup as its thing, and the fact that you can even say there's a worst matchup, I think it opens the door for us to discuss why maybe going a different route than what Brood War did in certain areas is actually warranted, because you don't really want to have these matchups where you are basically playing a completely different game. I have a bias towards some element of consistency. I'm not a fan of maps like Troy or Nemesis or Sparkle or stuff like that have been in the professional space of StarCraft 1 for some time now, where what we would end up seeing out of them is wildly different than what you would see out of more standard maps. But that's because I feel like they overshadow, in many ways, the subtle differences that you can get out of playing on Retro versus Radeon in the modern map pool. Those are very different maps, despite them both being roughly standard. Now, there's some things that are non-standard about Radeon, just like there are some things that are non-standard about Retro, Retro being the base count, Radeon being the very open middle of the map, and that does change a lot about how the maps play out. And those are the kinds of differences, I think, those, and maybe there's even more wiggle room in there, that I think are worth experimenting with, worth having within the game. But a map like Troy, where you can just make an island out of somebody and thus make it so that they can no longer actually use most of their production, certainly any of their ground production, without using like transports and stuff, that feels like it just gets very silly very quickly. Now, obviously, there's some things that, certain matchups are more affected than less. I think any matchup with Terran is heavily affected, particularly PvT, but also ZVT. I mean, if you think about it, you break out all those mutas, you can absolutely destroy those assimilators, right? Nemesis was really bad for pathing. You actually saw regularly more micro mistakes on Nemesis than on any other map, because Brood War pros, as good as they are, really are not used to, and should really, in my opinion, shouldn't be expected to micromanage the pathways of all of the units that they make out of their production facilities, because they already have to do that to some degree with micromanaging each individual production structure, right? We kind of call that like a mini game almost, where you use the camera to select each individual production structure and queue up a unit. Obviously, Cosmonarchy, you have multi-building select, but it still behooves you to know that camera control, because you will have different control groups, and we don't have tab to sort of select different subgroups, if you will. So it's still warranted then to have a camera thing, and then you can just control click on your, say, stockades for instead of barracks, and you can make like 3 units at a time instead of only 1, or whatever the case may be, right? So it's worth pointing out that there's like certain things that we do differently in Cosmonarchy that maybe would be still very much you'd translate those skills over, especially your macro skills and your plate spinning capabilities of constantly micromanaging and multitasking. Those kinds of things, I guess you'd call it task switching, really. That's maybe like the more official term than plate spinning. I just like plate spinning as a term. But task switching is absolutely a transferable skill. And I'd say that the Brood War players have a lot of an easier time playing Cosmonarchy than, say, the StarCraft 2 players that have come over and joined us, as an example. That doesn't mean that the StarCraft 2 players haven't had any success. It's just that they have to learn the Brood War macro style, or they'll maybe have to find their own style that still works for them, that doesn't involve using the camera hotkeys. That's what a player like Hupsea, the StarCraft 2 top 50 GM on the ladder right now, from Legacy of the Void onward, he has been struggling a little bit with like not really wanting to do the camera thing, and instead wanting to do the more StarCraft 2-esque method of just hotkeying production structures. But instead of putting them all into one thing and tabbing, he's got to use like 5, 6, 7. I mean, we added more control groups, so you can use R, T, F, G, V, B. But after a certain point, you run out, right? That's sort of his contention anyway. And so that makes plenty of sense to me. I understand why some people will have a different time of it than others. But Nemesis was a map where this really did fall apart for the Brood War pros. Like, they constantly and consistently made worse micro moves, and it depreciated the value of the games played on Nemesis. Now, there were later in Nemesis's lifespan as a competitive map, there were some build orders that specifically had building placement to try to give them the best shot possible, but the map could evolve what's a valid path in terms of actually moving your units around, but you would never actually see that change reflected within the unit pathfinding itself. Because fundamentally in StarCraft, your units will not be able to quote unquote see buildings for the purposes of calculating pathways. And that means that they will try to move around the buildings, but if there is no valid movement, like it's a total wall, they'll just haplessly spin. And that hapless spinning was something that the pros had to counteract at pretty much every step of the way for Nemesis, particularly in those mid games, right? So you would often end up seeing very aggressive games, despite it being a force spawn map. And I think when it was replaced by other maps and later on in the pool, like it currently is not in our map pool, thank God, for this tournament, season 17, but still is something that, echoes throughout history. And now Troy is there instead. Great. Now we have that. I think about, what was it, 76, right? That's a map that's just absolutely absurd. And I think everybody kind of knows it, and it has a million different gimmicks associated with it to try to make it do something different. But it all turns into Wraith spam versus Zerg. And, it's just, I think it degenerates the, I would say you do see a degeneration in terms of game quality. It depreciates the quality of the games and it degenerates the number of strategies, reduces them to something that is much more finite. And yes, it might be novel in a sense that we don't see those strategies being the premier strategies, or maybe even being possible in extreme cases on maps that are not 76 or Nemesis or Troy. But at the very end of the day, you're still talking about a situation where the maps are not behooving, the map pool is not behooving the plays, right? So we're not happy with those maps, generally speaking. There are some people who just like to see, I joke about them, they're like the Michael Bay enjoyers. They just like to see the explosions, right? And in that case, sure, you can absolutely have that be a valid reason to want some of the novelty. But I think as a purist, somebody who wants the best game, somebody who wants the best gameplay to watch and the best players to win, as an enjoyer of excellence, as somebody who, I subscribe more to the Duncan Thorin Shields school of thought when it comes to competitive formats and maps and I guess competitive tools in general. I'm not somebody who thinks RNG should be in the game at all and stuff like this. I'm the kind of guy who thinks you should instead just have, sure, a wide breadth of possible things to do to create a standard map, like a map that could be considered standard or played relatively standard, but the difference is making it very impactful for adapting in the middle of a series, and maybe having some maps that are, we even have this in our own map pool, actually, funnily enough, for Acropolis. We have Fata Morgana, which is a map by Veek7. I have to say that it's contractually obligated. And it's a map that has very short rush distance, right, compared to all of the other maps. And that will necessarily, it's also close by air in a way that most maps are not. It's a 2-spawn map, and it's close by air in a way that you're not going to see that in most maps. And what that does mean is that you might be encouraged to drop or to go for air in the early stages of the game. And it also means that you can mind game around that, right? So that creates some very interesting and novel gameplay. Maybe it's some people that, there's going to be some people who are better at playing standard than playing within those sort of adaptations, playing to the map in that sense. Or maybe the way that you play to the map can be more standard than that. On a map like Sideshow, it can actually be much more safe to expand 3 times to just hold your territory. On a map like Germination, to maybe even a greater degree, although it has a more vulnerable main for dropping. So there's all these different things that I think are valid for exploration. And I'm not saying that you have to be sort of a prude about it by never, stretching out. But I do think that maybe the ASL is not really the territory for that to be explored. I think maybe you shouldn't be using basically gimmick maps that maybe you could have an idea and experiment with and then find them lacking, find them wanting. In that situation, you would say, okay, maybe that's best for an underclass tournament, right? Maybe that's best for a tournament where, it could be not for the qualifiers per se, but maybe like the CNSL or something, right? As opposed to the ASL. As an example off the top of my head, maybe some of these more consistent leagues could do it, right? Like the KCM Race Survival series and stuff like that. Maybe that could be something that you would see different maps being used. Or maybe even going into the BSL location, right? BSL Hasu League or Gosu League or indeed Pro League. You could maybe see stuff like that a bit more often. But instead, because ASL does it and because ASL is the premier tournament, you're going to see the same maps pretty much all the time. And they regularly make very poor choices about maps as it pertains to, I would say, competitive integrity. Brood War also has a lot of native flaws when it comes to competitive integrity. We're talking about things like the ability to constantly have, for example, okay, here's a silly thing. I'm going to end up fixing this pretty soon, but there's a bug in the game that allows you to hold fire lurkers, and I find that really quite silly. I don't think that you should be able to, strategically deactivate the attacking of one particular unit that just so happens to be the most powerful kind of unit you could do that in. That is clearly not intended gameplay, and I think it does, If you added hold fire for everything, that would be different. But if you're going to say that hold fire only happens for, the one unit that if it has hold fire on, it could be utterly catastrophic in 0.5 seconds for units moving over them. I don't know, dude. I didn't think that burrowed banelings in StarCraft 2 were very good either, right? So that seems like more of the same in some ways. Although at least for the StarCraft 2 one, you had to manually hit something, right? Technically you manually undo the hold fire on the lurker, but what I mean by that is actually, I would argue that there's a little bit more counterplay and a chance for less chance for like one thing blowing up everything that you own for the banelings, which is not something I would normally say. I think they're one of the most stupid unit designs in any RTS game is the baneling. But then, of course, the Cyclops and the Disruptor and the Phoenix and, the list goes on. But don't worry. Or no, it's not Cyclops. It's Cyclone. Cyclops is actually a great unit, a great design. But yeah, so going back to what we're talking about here with regards to certain bugs and certain things that are just allowed within the game. The other thing is RNG. Like, why is that still in the game? Why is it that I have like a 47 or whatever it is % chance to miss when I'm attacking up a cliff or attacking a unit that is underneath a tree doodad or whatever? Why is that a thing? Like, seriously, who thought that was a good idea? And I just find that to be so silly. Like, you can technically play the percentages or whatever, but shouldn't there be a better way to have better control over your units? Shouldn't there be a better way to give yourself an advantage when you are I don't think under a tree should really give you an advantage at all, but say you are indeed like I would be much more tolerant of the idea of, being under a tree gives you +1 armor, or being up a ramp gives you more attack range. That's what we do. That last one is what we do in Cosmonarchy. We don't have any benefit for being under a tree, but when it comes to Cosmonarchy, yeah, we absolutely give you +2 weapon range when you're attacking a unit that has a height disadvantage to you. So it's more of a tool for the unit on the high ground than it is a punishment for a unit on the low ground. You can maybe split hairs, but we are adding a stat to the unit on the high ground. And again, you can maybe say that, we're adding dodge chance to the unit on the high ground. That's not really how it works. And, it's also stupid. I think anything that's related to RNG really should be removed from the game. We've gone through a lot of pain and a lot of effort, but we have successfully removed all of the random order delay and like the random attack rate delay and stuff. Some people will say that you need to have those random animation delays because what they will do is sort of spread out the sound effects for attacking, so that you don't hear the same sound effect looped over it multiple times. I think, for one, you can have variants of the sounds that maybe have like a 0.1 to, or I guess it would have to be even more subtle, like 0.05 delay, 0.05 second delay to it, or a 0.1 second delay to it, or whatever. And that would probably resolve all of those issues. So you could do that on the sound level, and they'd still be mostly synced, or pretty much all synced. But the way that the variants would work out is that you wouldn't hear the same sound playing all the time. So you would have a little bit of a difference. I think that would probably rectify that issue. So there's like workarounds that don't involve applying a slim element or indeed a significant element of randomness to the game and to how weapons interact with the enemies and all of this other stuff. It just seems very silly. So the reason why I bring these up is because I think there are a lot of flaws within Brood War. I think a lot of their spell casting, for example, is overly sort of focused on, right? Where you just point and click to eliminate a unit. That doesn't feel like there's much counterplay. It turns out the counterplay is not allowing them to get close enough by using Niduses to stop the irradiate from hitting, and just dealing with it. If not building the units that are weak to it. It feels like they are overly strong instead of them being more conditional. So in Cosmonarchy, for Irradiate, as an example, we converted it into a skill shot, right? A term borrowed from MOBAs, but it basically means it fires a missile that does not track the enemy, that moves a little bit slowly, so it allows you to move out of it. And any unit that is stuck in the area where that skill shot lands will then be irradiated, and Irradiate deals less damage. But the trade-off is it creates a persistent field that stays on the ground for a certain amount of time. I think it's about 10 seconds, could be a little bit off. And the reason why that happens is because you can use it as area denial. So it stops being I'm going to left click this unit to kill it, which also only works on some unit types, by the way. It doesn't work on mechanical targets, right? And the other thing that it also allows you to do is naturally deny certain terrain or say, hey, if you want to come to me through this pathway, you're going to have to take some damage. And so that becomes a choice from both the player using the ability and a player that is facing a player who is using the ability, right? So on both ends of the ability, as far as who's on the receiving end, who's on the giving end, I think it's just much better. It's certainly a lot more skill different. Now, it's different. That's definitely a thing. it's very different than what it was originally. The combat role of the unit that casts that ability is different, meaningfully, because of this change and because of many other changes. But that doesn't mean that, you couldn't come up with a better solution to irradiate that would make it so that the unit wasn't just a point-and-click eraser for a particular kind of unit where it just nullifies this unit from existing. It's a miracle that the Defiler itself is so unbelievably powerful, because if it weren't, I actually think the Science Vessel would be the bane of all Zerg players. And at low ranks, I'm sure it feels that they already are the bane of all Zerg players. So enough said, I suppose. As we get into the discussion of ZVZ, it's worth pointing out that this matchup is, a situation where there have been many solutions posited by the community. One solution has been to make it so that there's a balance change that specifically makes spore colonies deal extra damage or have extra range when targeting mutalisks. I don't think I need to say why this is a bad idea, because it seems really obvious that basically creating a hard counter system, the way that StarCraft 2 has, where, units will just deal plus extra damage to armored or whatever, they've got this tagging system that gives you attributes that make you take more or less damage fairly arbitrarily from many different attacks, explodes the sort of complexity of the game, but also is a very slippery slope. Now, if you were only going to make that one balance change, I guess that would be a very lame patchwork solution, but it also makes it very obvious. It automates the decision making for why, what you do versus mutalisks, right? I'm sure it would have a change, an impact on the meta, on the game. In fact, if spore colonies were generally a little bit better at maybe less tanky but dealt more damage, you might have a situation on your hands where it doesn't really affect, battle cruisers too much in TVZ, but it still improves versus mutas, because it will still be able to deal a lot of damage to them, and then you basically be used as a way to supplement home-based defenses, say Hydras or something, while you tech up. Who knows what it could actually yield? Because, of course, if you can get to Defilers, then at that point you can use Dark Swarm and all this other stuff. So I understand that in many ways it's a razor's edge. People are trying to figure out what's this one change that can be made to improve the situation. Another solution that's been touted has been localized map pools. So something where the only map pool that you get is changed for ZVZ, or maybe changed for all matchups, so that each matchup has their own map pool. Obviously, that would be, I would say, a very heavy resource drain on the mappers themselves, but I'm sure they would be down for the challenge. However, I will say that I feel like this is in many ways admitting defeat. In fact, I feel like balancing through maps has been the way that Brood War has admitted defeat, where the community has had to balance the game themselves, but they haven't taken the sort of tall order, if you will, of there are certain changes that you can make inside maps by increasing stats, right? Changing stats and changing costs. You cannot change certain details like attack speed or movement speed. You could change the cost of upgrades. You can change, including the time cost. You can change the HP, armor, mineral, and gas cost. You cannot change supply cost, I don't think. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure you can only change resource and time cost. There's a lot of things that you're very limited at if you're going to limit yourself to the map editor. Now you can try to use EUDs to change a lot of stuff, which is this advanced map making technique, but it has some other issues, like it disables saves, which I believe are required for certain niche cases. It disables the ability to use the extra entity limits, which are required for Valkyries to even be useful, for example, as well as, of course, if you ever get to a maxed out game, you wouldn't be able to do it. Although I don't know if that's even possible in 2v2 or in a 1v1 situation. But anyway, it's worth pointing all of these out, because the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there's not really that many tools available to you, but still some tools that you could maybe use to try to balance the game yourself, since each map could just have the same balance changes applied to it from another map, right? If you were going to do something like that. And you could make it consistent, and it would basically almost be like using a different data file for the game. It would be an unofficial balance update. Nobody's wanted to do that. Nobody wants to mod the tile sets to add real ramps instead of the shitty ones Blizzard added for the remaster, or indeed the shitty ones that people have been forced to use through the blends that obviously create really weird things like high ground on the bottom of the ramp and low ground on the top of the ramp that have plagued many an Artosis clip that I have seen, among other things, and probably have decided decided professional games and maybe perhaps professional careers due to the fact that there's essentially a bug with the ramp that was really hard to play around in context, even if the player themselves was aware of it, which I assume they were. There's a number of other issues that would be really nice to resolve. The fact that you can't actually have symmetrical maps or more symmetrical maps due to the resource layouts always having to have minerals and Vespene in certain configurations. I think you could fix a lot of that stuff the way that we fixed it in Cosmonarchy, and then you would actually have to be able to have, geysers on the bottom instead of the top, right? So you'd be able to fix up a lot of things if you just decided, fuck it, I'm going to make my own, build of the game, and we're going to make it so that it's more balanced. But I also understand that's also a slippery slope. Where do you draw the line? Do you want the balance by committee approach of StarCraft 2? I would hazard a guess to say that even though maybe the latest changes have been more positive than the previous ones, it hasn't been all roses, we'll say. It's definitely something that I think is unlikely to make sweeping changes and only really likely to sort of consolidate further in the same design paradigms. And maybe that's what we want, right? For Brood War, that does make some sense. But I just wanted to point out that, the fact that ZVZ has a bunch of people trying to think to themselves, what could we do to improve ZVZ specifically? What could we do to make it so that it's not so boring and bad for the game? And the answer is, you can't really do anything, because Kespa's not going to do anything to the game itself, and they're probably not going to adopt per matchup map pools. And if they did, that would basically be admitting defeat. And maybe that's what they should do if they're not going to do any of these other changes. It's not that making these very blunt changes to the game, like hard countering mutas with spore colonies, or improving the, or changing the map pool, I should say. It wouldn't be an improvement in my opinion, but changing the map pool per matchup, I think it adds a lot of complexity and it's not ideal. But it's not to say that it wouldn't result in a better end product. It's just to say that it feels like a very backwards way of designing. You're starting out with an outcome that you want, and it's not very vague, it's very specific. And you're trying to balance around that outcome, and you often will have catching strays. You'll have some side effects that you couldn't have foreseen. You'll have some negative consequences, second and third order consequences to those decisions that you can't have foreseen. Whereas instead, if you just step back and think, what if I just make a game that is better than Brood War? What if I just make a matchup where there's so much choice to have, so many choices to make when it comes to your composition, that realistically speaking, it's quite impossible to have one unit dominate the entire meta. And if it is, there's plenty of fodder for you to try to decide, what else to make, right? And how to deal with that. So I thought it was an interesting thing to discuss for the first sort of half hour of this show, was the fact that ZVZ is so bad for Brood War, according to so many people, is pretty good for us over here in Cosmonarchy. Because if you watch our ZVZs, I'll have a link to a couple in the description of this video, you're going to see some pretty different things. You're going to see a lot of units being used, and part of that's because we have 50 units per race, not like StarCraft, which has, 11 or 12 or whatever. But another part of it is because, we just don't have the idea that, you're going to be on a knife's edge at all times with your larva production and such. That still is a very heavily emphasized element of the Zerg identity, but there are more ways that you can do it. For example, there's an extra larva production structure you can mutate from the creep colony equivalent that gives you larva at the same rate as a hatchery, but at the same time, it costs a lot of Vespene gas. But you could already imagine that if you were banking a bunch of gas and you, instead of going layer, you went for that, maybe that could be something that would allow you to do stuff in the early stages of the game, and you wouldn't have to spend minerals on a hatch. You could still spend the minerals on workers, for example, or more Zerglings, right? There's a couple of different things that maybe that would change. And that seems like a more interesting thing to do than to, increase weapon damage or range when targeting a specific unit. I feel like that's just very silly and backwards design, instead of forward thinking and providing more tools to the player, because really that's the problem to me. The problem is that ZVZ doesn't have enough tools. And if you just specifically fashion one tool for dealing with one thing, that's not really the same thing as providing many more tools that then the players can use to their own volition and provides their own sort of value. Now that I'm done talking about the old stuff, let's talk about the new stuff. That's right. Beyond Brood War, going into Cosmonarchy's premier tournament, Acropolis #1, the first tournament of its kind for year 2 of our competitive saga. Let's talk about round 2, the fact that the analysis section is now in order. I think really the exciting part for me about the way that round 2 played out is that we got to see some nice play out of, I guess, like the old god favorites. I'm thinking about Neblime, and I'm thinking about the Shambler in particular. But we also got to see Newt fairly comfortably dispense with Taco Cake. Shout out to Taco Cake, one of the 2 players to be eliminated. General Anakin unfortunately did have to forfeit his match against Art of Turtle. That's the first time that's happened in a throne room or playoff stage. So a little sad about that, but appreciate everybody who did participate, even if they're no longer in it. And shout out to Taco Kick again, because he just summoned frauds to play some more, even though he's out of the tournament currently. He's still very eager to continue playing, which is really nice, really cool to see, man. But we also got, like I mentioned, Neblime and the Shambler going through over Hamster and Hubsea, respectively. That means that Hubsea will face off against Newt in the lower bracket, an exciting PVT. Will our only Terran player continue to play well, continue to go against the grain and represent his race, or will Hubsea just demolish him? I'm not really sure, but Hubsea has been playing a lot of Terrans lately. I don't actually know how... Hubsea and Newt have been practicing against each other a lot, which is pretty interesting. I wonder if Newt's like reserving some strategies, because that's pretty wild, Hamster versus AOT is an exciting one for me, because Hamster has shown some mortality against Neblime. He took one game, but it was very close, and Neblime otherwise was kind of leading the series. Definitely looked like the more practiced player, and in large part due to Hamster's lack of recent practice. But against AOT, Hamster is still favored. I think it could be a 4 or 5 game set, but either way, I think Hamster will say goodbye to Art of Turtle. If AOT does complete the upset, I mean, what a legendary performance at that point, right? Going in from the lower bracket, he'd be just a few wins away from making it to the finals. And I feel like that's pretty unlikely. But if Hubsea beats Newt, then we're talking about Art of Turtle having to deal with, the Protoss of Hubsea, who he took to a 5-game series, couldn't complete the reverse sweep, but still managed to make it bloody. Then went up against, Hamster. If he makes it past Hamster, that's another Protoss he's felled. And now would have a rematch against Hubsea if Hubsea beat Newt the way that I currently predict it will be. I don't know, man. I feel like, to put all the cards on the table, I think Hubsea versus Newt is 3-1 Hubsea. I think Hamster versus Art of Turtle is 3-1 or 3-2 Hamster. And I think at that point, I actually have no idea how to call that one, because Hubsea's mirror matchup has been practiced pretty well, and Hamster, I don't think, by the same boat. What I do know is players like Eclipso and maybe even Top Ramen's Protoss are going to be in high demand for practice partners, since they are not in the tournament currently, but they are high-level Protoss players, especially Eclipso has been absolutely dumpstering people. Crazy stuff. But on the side of Hubsea versus Hamster, I think you have to edge that to Hubsea based on recent form and practice. If it's Newt who upsets Hubsea and goes up against Hamster, I don't know about that one, man. That could be pretty rough. I think if Newt wants to play the upset merchant, go all the way to that Elimination 3 match that's up again for round 4, the final round of the tournament, that would have to be a situation where Newt hopes that AOT also does the upset, and then maybe the TVZ can carry him through, right? But as it currently stands, I don't know, man. I'm not so sure, man. But we cast our eyes up to the upper final, right? I've already predicted the series in the lower situation, and those the 2 winners there will have to fight against each other to decide who even meets the 2 members here. So Neblime against the Shambler. I have a feeling this is going to be another 3-1 in favor of Neblime, and the reason for that is because Hamster has the right ideas, but the wrong execution sometimes. The Shambler, I'm not so sure that he's practiced against a lot of Zerg lately. I mean, I've seen him summon for practice, and I'm not sure he's actually gotten it is the problem. So it'll be interesting, man. But I do think that as somebody of the Shambler's caliber, he always has a puncher's chance. He does say that he wants to win this tournament and immortalize his grandpappy in the tournament as an advisor. Because for those who don't know, when you win a tournament, you get access to a couple of perks. Obviously, you get the lion's share of the prize money, but you also will receive the ability to add an emoji to the server, and that's what was used for the Purifier, by the way, for Neblime, right? The Legionnaire icon, but it's called Purifier ? Because Neblime always makes that. He
he ended up redeeming it for that. Now, when it comes to Shambler, if he was to do it, I don't know what his emoji would be, but I'm pretty sure that his advisor pick would end up being, because that's another perk you get. You get to add an advisor to the game. And, we could just keep rolling that in, right? Like if you win 2 tournaments, you get 2 advisors. Why not? You can request them. So Mystery Meat way back requested the Mesk advisor. He was the first custom advisor we added. And that was where I got the idea from, but I didn't know, like we were still like in the early stages of adding support for that. So I didn't know how possible it would be to add that to the Ascension prize perch, so to speak. But for Acropolis, definitely seems like it makes sense. So here we are. Will Shambler get his wish? He does stand a pretty good chance. Even if he falls to Neblime here, he'll play the winner of, if we imagine Hepsea and Hamster the ones to proceed through, he'll play the winner of those. He did 3-0 Hepsea. It was a pretty close set. I don't know how to call that because Hepsea is obviously the guy who comes back stronger every time, it feels like. So I don't know. It's so wacky. It's hard to call, but I would probably say that, you have to give Shambler the favor there. You can't really construct an argument where Shambler's not the favorite if he 3-0'd the guy. Now, if it's Hamster, I think Shambler's aggression can definitely give him the number, but I also think Hamster might do some stuff that is just unexpected. By the way, Hamster also was the guy to knock Shambler out. He knocked him into the lower bracket in Ascension 6, I believe. Oh no, he knocked Neblime into the lower bracket. My mistake. I think maybe he also did it to Shambler because he did. He won the upper final against the Shambler in Ascension 6 because the upper semifinal 1 was the surprise where Shambler was able to beat Mystery Meat in a 5-game set. And Mystery Meat went down to the lower bracket and completed the run to go all the way up to the final and eventually win the trophy. But it was... Yeah, it was pretty wild. And then so then Hamster obviously defeated the Shambler. I think it was a 3-1 set in the upper final of that tournament. And then in the lower bracket, the Shambler awaited Hamster in the lower final, and Hamster dismantled him as well, though it was a 4-game. I think it was a 4-game set because it was 3-1 over. It was 3-1 over Sarcasm, 3-1 over the Shambler, and then the ever illustrious 3-4 scoreline where Neblime took it, edged it out, and he just couldn't play Cosmonarchy anymore. Man, Hamster played so many matches in a row he could not play. He technically, if you just go by scoreline, he won 3 separate best of 5s, but the final was a best of 7. It was very different. So. Anyway, exciting stuff aside, match history aside, you have to give the current form to Shambler for sure. So I'd say even if he falls to Neblime, he's the favorite to get back into the grand final for a rematch. And who knows what happens there? It's a longer series. The advantage goes to probably the guy who got there first. And if that's Neblime, I imagine he's just going to ban Titanforge and pick Sideshow because at that point it's a 7-map situation. So the guy in the upper final, the guy who made it through in the upper seed, his advantage, besides not having to play the lower final before going into the upper final on the same, or the grand final in the same day, his advantage is he simply has the opportunity to play out, what is it, I don't know, dude. It's pretty exciting overall, but he has the advantage of being able to just say ban a map, pick a map, and Shambler can do nothing. But that does leave Fata Morgana in the pool, and Neblime has he's not been very fond of a map by Week 7. I don't know why. Anyway, that will pretty much do it. Round us out for the discussion of Throneroom. I just wanted to make it obvious here that I'm very excited for the tournament. I've been thinking about it a lot. And sort of like the next discussion point, I'm also excited about what it means in the future because we'll be able to, test out the new patch. We've got a new version of the game looming, and it's something that I think will be pretty well received all in all. It's got some exciting visual updates as well. And, like Maverick Stimpack and Madcap Reads and the Savant visual update for their overlay as well, where they have like an overlay that indicates what their forms, that they switched forms, and then there's like a slight cooldown on it now. So it's like a little bit of a balance tweak as well. Yeah, I don't know. There's all sorts of cool stuff. Like the Gladius has a read for when it's channeling things. And, the Legionnaire has -1 sight range. Oh my God, such a nerfed unit. And, all this other stuff. So I just think it's worth pointing out because it's like, just like with what I'm about to talk about, I'm very excited about what's to come. So I wanted to mention that. We're going to jump into what is to come with is the Zerg tutorial, dude. The Zerg tutorial is coming on in, and I just need to finish up fixing some trigger issues and then improving the enemy AI. And it's pretty much ready for testing on pre-release. So very excited about that. I will also need to ask people to eventually, hopefully people can do this in relatively short order on pre-release when I do this, but I will hopefully have people test the other tutorials because I will have made some changes to them, and Veek has updated the trigger parser, refreshed that code to be a little bit more up to date with current standards. And that means that maybe there's some bugs that made it through, right? Because it's hard to test every single one of them. I think eventually I will need to create like you'd call it a unit test, but for triggers. The custom triggers will need a map that has every single custom trigger that you can create or you can make happen by like moving a unit to a location and have like one kind of switch like that for every trigger action. It's a little bit more complicated than that because there's different permutations. Like you can have like a unit count test, which is one of the trigger conditions that tests for a location, tests for locations are like zones that you put down in the map. So that's different than like just a generic area. It can do a generic area as well. And it can do like, I think it can also do, there's something else that it could do. It's like a point instead of a location. There's some arguments that are points, which is exact coordinates. That would be like for detecting your camera position and stuff. It would be an area. And then for an exact position, it would be some other stuff like setting certain points up for the AI or whatever. So anyway, the reason why I'm bringing all this stuff up is because you can have these sorts of features in the game, but if you're updating them and you're updating code that touches all of them and you don't have an easy way to test every individual thing, that can be very arduous to Akko, when he was still active in the community, had said something along the lines of untested code is or unverified and untested code is not production ready, basically, right? So now we're not really great fans of like code tests, like going super heavy into massive tests, but I can see the value in them, and I think that V can probably also see the value in them now as we get deeper and deeper. It's hard to apply that to code base that is fundamentally closed source. We don't have StarCraft code. We have to reverse engineer it. So it's a very different working environment than what we would be used to if we were writing our own engine, as we were and still are when it comes to Antikythera. So yeah, worth pointing out there, maybe some lessons to carry over. But as a result of that change, I will be verifying the Zerg tutorial, but I haven't had the chance to verify the Terran tutorial stuff yet, although I did add some fixes and, of course, enabled the bank data, which is very exciting. The bank data will allow you to do a bunch of different things. As a mapper, you'll be able to basically confirm that, like, somebody, for example, has watched a full-length version of a certain dialogue event, and if they have, play a different version of that dialogue event that's more cut down. So that would be, for example... When we have a situation like the Terran tutorial, you boot up and there's that pretty lengthy exchange between Satoshi, Osina, and Makrill. And the cut down version just has Osina say, "I'm coming for you, cadet," and then Makrill say, "And I'm coming for you." And then Satoshi says, "Let's do this," or "Piece of cake, let's do this." And so it's like, all right, we're in. That's all we really needed to know. That's like the gist of what's happening. You establish your enemy, you establish your advisor, and you establish your protagonist. And in 3 quick lines, right? So you can skip the briefing and jump straight in, and you'll have a very quick introduction. So I think that's very valuable to have. It reduces friction when you restart the same mission over and over again, which is a key deal. Because if you keep losing in the Terran tutorial and you have to keep hearing that over and over again, or you hit skip or whatever, you can hit skip with escape to just completely skip it. But it can still maybe be a little bit annoying and jarring, and it's not ideal. I think this is going to be really nice. So yeah, having the alternate intro is something that I long scripted for. Now we have the ability to activate it within our own environment using these custom triggers. Really nice implementation by Veek as well, where it basically treats it like a custom variable that we already have anyway, but it links any write to that variable to the bank, and it reads the value from the bank, and the bank is just a file that is stored inside your saves folder, funnily enough, or inside the same folder there for your root StarCraft folder. So great stuff from Veek. Very, very much appreciate his contributions there. So that's a new feature that was integral for a couple of details, but we are going to pair its arrival with the Zerg tutorial, and we're also going to be fixing up those issues. So yeah, I think in just a few more days, I don't believe I'll be able to release it in the month of April, technically. I'm recording this on the last day of April, and I will be streaming some development of that Zerg tutorial, but I don't necessarily want to rush the deployment of that to pre-release. However, I do think that pretty soon after, as the first couple of days of May, you'll see it deploy. And maybe we'll even talk about that on a forthcoming episode of Crow's Nest, which we'll be recording later on this week if plans hold up. So there you go. Some updates to the Zerg tutorial. I'm happy enough with the voice acting and the writing. So I think we'll leave it at that. And we'll just continue working on the other stuff, the other exciting stuff. The reason why I was drawing so many comparisons to the tournament and to this Zerg tutorial is because the things that happen after are very exciting, as well as, of course, having the final version of this thing released or the final day of the tournament completed or whatever. All that stuff is very exciting. All that stuff is great content. All that stuff is great to have. But also, I'm very excited about moving on to the next thing, too. And so... yeah, I don't know. I'm not really the type of person to just sit there and bask in the moment a lot of the time. It doesn't mean I don't fully appreciate the gratitude or the, I guess, grandiosity as well of what is actually happening in a given moment. Because like the tournaments, the finals and stuff, like those can be really hype moments. But, and just like, finally having another tutorial mission completed and saying that, okay, there's tutorials for each race now, and I don't need to worry too much about, educating people by hand as much. They can at least use that as a sandbox. I feel like that's great. And it's definitely something that, you can pat yourself on the back for, so to speak. But I would really like to just be, right now, I would love to be, knee deep in a single player campaign development. And I would also, I'm very keen on seeing what happens with the tournament that follows this, which will be an invitational that will be, inviting some new people, not just new to the community like Eclipso and Top Ramen and stuff to show their stuff again, or maybe for the first time, as is the case for some people. It will also be a situation where, I don't know, I'm just very excited about, bringing in brand new people, like, getting Urbon back in, getting maybe Misters, and I still don't know how to say that dude's name. People say Misters, but that's not how he pronounces it. I'll have to ask him how to pronounce it at some point, since presumably I'll be casting him. He's a high-level Protoss player in StarCraft 1. Just getting more and more people involved, right, and bringing them into the tournament. I'll definitely give Saiyan an invite if he's keen, see what he's up to. And so, yeah, I'm excited about what comes next for Cosmonarchy always, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also stop and smell the roses, dude. There's a lot of roses to smell, a lot of cool shit going on right now in this realm. So stay tuned, stick around. You'll definitely enjoy what's coming. And that brings us to none other than the penultimate section here before we get to the coffee questions. Let's talk about audiovisuals, new features, and balance tweaks. I already mentioned the bank data stuff, so that's a new feature that we have. Another one that we have, by the way, all of this stuff is always recapped as well in none other than the Cosmonarch's Compass, which is my sort of devlog that I write once a week. I always write it before recording these episodes, so I always link them in the description. You can check them out. But yes, we have indeed achieved some pretty cool stuff. Minimap scaling has now been improved courtesy of Dark and Fantasies. I think there was some help from X405 on the initial idea of it or whatever, but definitely something where DF was able to come in with the heavy lifting on the code and provide us with the features. We also sped up the camera update rate for the player's camera, like the white box that you see, not the cameras that we see as witnesses or as in team games or whatever. So that will be much faster now as well, which is pretty hype. Anyhow, the gist of the minimap feature here is that we can finally start using map sizes that are a little bit more different than the 128 by 128 or what have you. 160 by 96 was a very specific map size that Veek was using for maps like Pendulum and Pantheon. You may remember from a couple of moons ago now, if you've been here long enough, where obviously one of the main things to point out was the map size was really, really small on the minimap, right? Like that it was super zoomed in. And that's because once you pass 128, with the map size, it starts to use the next size up for minimap rendering. So DF has effectively added more steps for minimap rendering, and it scales much more uniformly to whatever the map size is. So I've tested with 124 by 124, and it's still perfectly square in the minimap as an example. I've also tested with the aforementioned 160 by 96. It looks a lot better, a lot more zoomed in, so to speak. So great work by DF, and absolutely a vital feature for map making. You can be a little bit more creative with your map sizes. I'm sure Biddy B is listening to this and celebrating because he was already very excited when we ended up adding it in. So yeah, of course he's going to celebrate now. Aside from that, new features include the sort of, like I mentioned, bank data, the minimap stuff. Now we can talk a little bit about some balance tweaks and some audio visuals. I'm going to pair them together here because one of the balance changes that I've made is increasing the size of the Ancestral Archives massively and decreasing the size of the Grand Library slightly. And the way I achieved this was, funnily enough, moving the Grand Library graphic to the Ancestral Archives and then providing a new graphic for the Grand Library that is 4x4. Still bigger than a gateway, but not as bigger when it comes to it's the same width as the gateway, but it's one tile higher, taller, I guess. Whereas the Grand Library was the same height as I guess it was actually wider than a gateway by 1 and taller than a gateway by 1. So now it's only taller than a gateway by 1 instead of also being wider. And that doesn't sound like a big change, but I promise you can fit so many more Grand Libraries in places. So it's really miraculous what a small change like that can do. Now, in theory, we could make it the same size as the gateway itself, but without changing the graphic, I think you could justify that kind of with the way that the graphic looks visually. But it's definitely a more comfortable size the way it is now relative to its visual space that it takes up. And I think it's fine to have that be a scale up, right? We're so slowly growing up from gateway to Grand Library to Ancestral Archives instead of being like gateway, massive blow up to Grand Library and massive shrink, even smaller than a gateway for the Ancestral Archives, which is just using the Templar Archives graphic. So that's great. Eventually, of course, we'll update the Ancestral Archives, the former Grand Library graphic to be better in general. Something that definitely needs to be done is give it more obvious work animations. But this is another graphic ripped from 5 Nations, so I'm happy to achieve that and provide for all of y'all homies out there. I do think that it's great to include stuff like this. I think having better stuff like that, better sizes for it. I'm actually halfway of mind to make another rip of what was formerly the Automaton Register graphic and use it for the lattice, like replace the lattice entirely, even though I really like the work animation that DF made for it. The lattice itself is very small, and the Automaton Register is 3x3, so it's not as big as a gateway still, but it's slightly taller, right? It's one tile taller than the lattice, and that would make it a little bit more sensible, I think. Maybe you could even justify slightly reducing the mineral cost for the lattice in that point, if it's also taking up more build space. Maybe not, I'm not sure, but it would be something to consider, and I think that's worth pointing out, right? It's actually pretty neat to imagine a world where you're looking at the way that you approach this sort of thing. You're looking at the fact that you have these building sizes that are kind of out of whack. Just making one, or I guess technically 2 changes like this, it starts to make you think, wait, what could I do to maybe somehow make it so that we have that natural sort of move up with the lattice and then the ardent and then, the synthetic synod, which is actually, I think, slightly smaller than the ardent or maybe the same size. Now, technically the Grand Library and the prostration stage, I believe, are probably the same size as well. But still, having that more natural slope up is a lot better. You think about Stargate into Argosy, but then you think about the Monument of Sin, and the Monument of Sin is not that sizable, but I do have a graphic that could maybe replace it. You never know. There's a couple of ideas that I got cooking, so definitely stay tuned for more stuff like that, but that's a balance tweak that I thought was worth pointing out. And I'm going to do a quick scan through the balance changes that we've already got to see if I can update you guys on anything. I did drop the Gateway armor to 3 from 4, and I finally successfully dropped the Circuit Cesian armor from 3 to 2. I just forgot to do that earlier and I had it in a patch note, but it was a flawed patch note. It was a fraudulent patch note. The Ancestral Archives does get a significant durability bust, or buff, I should say, when given the fact that it takes up much more space. So it has 300 more health, 1 more armor, the same amount of shields. Maybe that'll change. Doesn't seem supremely impactful, but you never know. And then the Grand Library itself has 200 less HP and 100 less shields. So that's in conjunction with the build space changes, right? Now, when we go to the Terrans, I did increase the Paladin missile speed and splash radius, so that will give it back some of its old power, and I think it'll be a much more appropriately priced and positioned unit in the tech tree. So I definitely am looking forward to people using that on the new version. Salamanders also got a slight change. They got 10 less HP, 1 more weapon range, and the mineral cost went from 100 to from 150 to 100. So it's much more of like a gas biased unit now. You can think of it as. So that is that should make it a little bit more approachable. I'm not sure if it's not like too cheap now to feel proper as like a tier 2 unit, but I think it's prohibitive mostly based on gas, right? So hopefully that will be enough of a change to see them be, given a little bit more love. I actually still think they had like a pretty solid use case in some matchups, particularly versus Zerg. It's a little bit weird that they attack air but don't splash air. I mean, they technically do splash air, but the fact that they attack air at all is a little bit strange. So I'm kind of half of mind to maybe like drop the gas cost by 25, because there's 150 for those who don't know, and then make it so that they're anti-ground, anti-surface only, or maybe give them a unique air weapon in addition to the one. So they would be like maybe having a weak-ish air weapon. I don't know why this came to my mind, but I was thinking about how the Liberator in StarCraft 2 has a weak anti-air attack. The problem is that when you stack up enough of them, they just annihilate air stacks, which is really silly. I would think maybe the Salamander would have like an Apollyoid adhesive applying anti-air attack that would be single target, and the anti-ground attack would obviously leave behind the weapon fields and deal some splash damage, which I think would be pretty neat. So maybe that's like a more exciting revision of it, and we can keep the costs as it is currently. But it having +1 weapon range and having cheaper mineral cost means that you don't need as much durability, so 10 less HP. That does mean that they will drop like flies, though, so you got to watch out, because I think they'll be surprisingly not very durable. I'm also considering durability increases to the Madrigal, but I have not made them yet. And I have adjusted the gas cost of the Tinker's Tower -25, so it's 75 instead of 100. I've decreased the mineral cost of the Blackjack and decreased its HP by 10. Might be too much, might be not enough. Honestly, they were pretty good before, but now they'll be more spammable, so we'll see. They'll be a little bit more reliant on Anseals for the anti-burst, particularly versus Protoss. But, maybe you can afford to do that now a little bit more. Cyclops got +5 HP, nothing major, just felt like making them a little bit more different role-wise from the Blackjack. The Blackjack being more spammable and fragile, while the Cyclops costs Vespene, so you can't spam it as much, but you can afford to give it a little bit more durability, I think. It should be interesting. The Eidolon, on the other hand, is in a situation where its mineral cost has been decreased by 25. We talked about this, as well as the Shaman mineral cost decreasing by 25 previously, and indeed, the Cyprian did get +1 weapon range. So that is a rundown of those. I already mentioned the Legionnaire having -1 sight range now. So that's all that we've done so far. Like I mentioned, the Madrigal is under consideration, the Salamander under more of a consideration with that unique anti-air weapon. I think generally speaking, as a bit of a note, I like units that have multiple weapons, but I feel like sometimes they were added without that much consideration, or maybe there was like an idea behind it. Like I look at the Uptecton, and it's the last remaining Protoss unit with multi-target, which obviously is something I've been phasing out for Protoss in general. And I think it could be interesting if instead of them having an air attack with their secondary weapon, they had an anti-ground single target attack that was specifically something that was shorter range than their primary one, right? And the reason why that would be interesting or compelling to me is because basically it provides them with a little bit of like self-peel, but it won't be too significant. I was even maybe thinking about like, what if I gave them the Hierophant passive, where they apply a slow effect or something, or maybe I could give them something else. But I don't necessarily want to make the unit an all-rounder, because it is supposed to be a siege unit. But it makes sense for a unit of that it's going to be much bigger eventually when it has its own model. It makes sense for a unit of that level of scale, of that level of power, it being an endgame tech unit. It definitely, I think it makes sense for the Uptecton to have that level of power to it, of potency, to have a secondary weapon. It just shouldn't be a secondary weapon that also makes air very, very easy to deal with under certain circumstances. Obviously, heavy air will still snipe it. Critical stacks of Sundogs and such will still snipe it, but it'll deal a decent amount of damage in response, especially if there's a lot of them. So I think that that will be a healthy change for the Uptecton. And I feel like more units with secondary attacks or second weapons that even just like specialized air and ground attacks or whatever is probably a better thing or an interesting thing. Like the fact that the Hippogriff has that is pretty neat. I think the Phobos should probably have that as well. The Centaur obviously has it's not an air or ground only attack, but it has a secondary attack that is also short range, just like the Uptecton. And also the Durandal, funnily enough. The Durandal is the inverse, where its secondary attack is it's just like a rifle that I've modeled, but I haven't attached with like a turret similar to the Watchdog, where it's not a real turreted unit, but it provides you with a little bit of something visually. Eventually I'll need to do that. The Durandal in this position is going to be like one such example where it has a secondary weapon that fires versus air or ground, and it fires from a range and it fires while moving, but the Durandal main gun shoots like its main attack is flamethrowers, right? So anyway, that's kind of funny, but I figured I would point that out too. In fact, it just occurred to me that since I have the source for the Durandal and for the Hurakan, I can and probably should take Solstice's model work for like the flame tubes and stuff, scale them up and attach them to the Durandal stuff so that they visually look like they have that kind of flamethrower stuff. And I could probably also borrow the materials if I'm not already using them. I think I am, but maybe he's using a more up-to-date version for the Hurakan. And yeah, okay, that's another thing to point out is that we obviously also did the visual update for the Hierophant. It's in production as of today. I was able to upgrade the Blender file to the latest version of our pipeline, and that was originally by Balethal, but I made some changes to the mesh, including adding some new features to further differentiate the silhouette. But I also was able to change some of the materials slightly and rescaled it a little bit so it's a little bit different. And I feel like it's going to be pretty nice. Vic pointed out that the leg silhouette is a little bit similar, too similar in perhaps to the Dracodon. I feel like the best fix for this would probably be to change the animations a little bit so that the legs are like posed differently. They're a little bit more like, spread out across a different axis maybe or something. But I'm also fearful that that'll change the unit too much to the point where it won't look like a Strider anymore. And I also, on a more practical level, I'm not the kind of guy who can do great walk cycles yet. And I don't necessarily want to try on a quadruped where the animation has to be pretty good. It's a little bit differently to animating a biped, right? So I'm already struggling with the biped, as you might have noticed with the Legionnaire animation that I do intend to improve on, and the Madcap and the Apostle and all this other stuff that I do need to improve the walk cycles for. So I don't necessarily want to jump into the deep end without sort of mastering that, or at least getting to some better degree of comfort for that. So practically speaking, we can release it now and maybe tweak it later if it comes to time to do that, and I'm sure it will. But this will still be a pretty significant upgrade. The question of can you immediately tell it's a Hierophant versus a Dracodon, I think it's still very easy to tell in the moment. But in motion, I could imagine a world where maybe it's harder to pick them apart. One thing that could be done to improve that is slightly increase the collision size of the Dracodon and maybe the Hierophant as well. I actually don't know if the Hierophant already takes up more size or not, but that would be another thing to maybe consider is doing it that way. And in fact, I did consider increasing the scale of the Hierophant, but the problem with that is if I do that, then we're in an awkward position for the Dracodon, since the Dracodon is more durable than the Hierophant, but the Hierophant would be bigger. Then you get into that awkward territory that StarCraft 2 had, where the Ghost is more impactful than like the Marauder in terms of its power, so it has to be taller than the Marauder, even though that doesn't really help it stand out, right? So that's like one example that I think I would like to try to work around. If anything, maybe the Dracodon itself should be slightly bigger, right? Like it should be like 1.05x increase or 1.1x increase, right? 5% or 10% basically. So maybe we'll try that instead. And just watch this space because we're going to continue building out more visual updates to the units. This will cement the Disciple units out of the gateway as all having custom models with the exception of the Zealot, which, it has a recolor, but it's not a custom model. Eventually, the Zealot will also be replaced with a new graphic, I'm sure. And at some point, I do want to update the Legionnaire so that the walk cycle is better, but also that its weapon is integrated into its arm, similar to the Ecclesiast and the Zealot itself. It's going to have like a wrist spear or an arm spear instead of a handheld weapon. That's obviously not really my cup of tea as far as the Protoss design is concerned. For the Adherent, funnily enough, I also have him just holding a greatsword. That needs to be turned into like a great saber for that's wrist mounted, right? That's a factional Protoss unit for the Order of the Sacred Saber. Ideally, we'll work that in pretty soon because I'm not a great fan of how it worked out visually. Even though like Solstice was the original author of the model and he just made it have like a handheld spear. He did that without any direction from me. And I didn't really even notice it at first, but then thinking about it in the past couple months, I've realized it's actually very thematic to have all of their melee weapons and maybe all of their infantry weapons in general be wrist mounted. I think that's pretty legit. So, the Legionnaire needs it. The Charlatan needs some treatment since it looks very similar to the Ecclesiast. Definitely needs to be redone. And I've already, kit bashed the Ecclesiast into the Vagrant, which does look very different and does also have like a wrist-mounted weapon. So it makes sense to do that for the Charlatan as well. At some point, I'm sure I can build something out that will look suitably profane or, criminal, the criminal element. We'll get into the criminal element in today's coffee questions, so stay tuned for that as well. But just some lovely notes there, some lovely developments that we've had for this round of Cosmonarchy updates. We make this game better every day, all the time. And remember, I've been doing a lot of daily dev streams as well, so stay subbed to the channel if you want more of those. And you can always also every now and then for the castovers, I'll also talk about recent developments sometimes as part of the commentary as well. So you'll occasionally hear that in there, and I think that's worth pointing out too every now and then. All right, we are going to move into the community roundup. This is one of my favorite sections that I've added to every episode of Prototype. It's right before the coffee questions where you can, again, donate your hard-earned cash to the cause of development. But I'm also going to talk about the community here. I'm going to talk about the people who, whether they've donated or not, have made a splash, made some element happen here. And first, I want to introduce some new players, some new joiners, some people who have popped in since the last episode was recorded. And that includes Krankendow, who is going to have their Castover debut in the same day that this releases publicly on the 1st of May. I think I'm saying their name correctly. They're from Lithuania. Crazy stuff. Then after that, we had, let's see, funnily enough, we had the friend of, I want to say, was it also Krankendow? No. It couldn't have been. Somebody's friend, whose name is Slayer's Boxer, with a vulture portrait, shout out to him, maybe it was Crank's friend, joined the server and got their stuff set up. They've been playing, I don't know what I should actually call them. I can't call them Slayer's Boxer, obviously. It's not the legit guy, although it would be really funny if it was. We had Tuna Base come in, and he was playing a couple of matches. I think he was Protoss, I'm not 100% sure. Shout out to him for doing that. We had Rayu the Frozen Rose just set up their game today. We'll see if they're keen to play. We had Caveat Draco, who's been playing a lot of versus AI and campaign stuff. Klimoy from China, crazy that he's been able to put his hands on the project. And he's also been playing a lot of the versus AI and stuff. And other than that, I think that's everybody who's actively played a game to my knowledge. But always want to shout out the new guys and say, hey, man, welcome. Hey, men, welcome, indeed. Very exciting stuff, of course. So with that out of the way, I can now talk about the maps that have been worked on since the last time we spoke. This first one is Blackwater Bastion. It's a 4-spawn map from none other than BiddyBee. In fact, you know what? I think I'll even quickly switch over to a browser view so you can see the maps with me. All right, as mentioned, this is Blackwater Bastion, a map by BiddyBee, a 4-spawn map. He used the 4-way symmetry option XY, so it's not rotationally symmetric like my map Iron Lung, which I never ended up showing, but I'll skip over because I haven't worked on it since the last episode of Prototype. And as you can see, we've got, corner spawns, fairly basic stuff. I think he said that he was practicing map making or emulating the style of some of the ASL maps. I know the Shambler said that for one of his maps that's in the can here for me to take a look at. So it's interesting to me to see what's up with that, if that was indeed something that BiddyBee was thinking about. You've got the patented BiddyBee style where you have the main natural with a little bit of a, not really an overhang, but like you can kind of fight into this choke. This actually reminds me of his space platform map. The name escapes me right now, but it was modeled after Blitz Y. So that could be kind of interesting to go back and contrast later. That's also available in the Uprising folder of the maps directory for Melee. And I don't believe this map is currently available, but I'm about to probably go ahead and push it because I think it's ready now. He was waiting for the minimap update, which is indeed done. But following my cursor here in the top left of the map, we've got the teal spawn, goes into the natural. Nice little choke you can try to wall or deal with, and then you jump into the third base, which is on the low ground, and you can split it from multiple angles. And you can sort of attack from the 9 o'clock position here, but not exactly. I do like that the ramps here are a little bit more like XY for the middle of the map. I feel like that's something that I favor myself. Obviously, the middle of the map is fairly open, but you do get a little bit of cover to play around here, particularly horizontal spawn, even though it's obviously going to be the closest spawn position, judging by the map size. It's kind of nice that you can maybe hold this high ground and then force your opponent, if they want to take a very short path, to go directly through you and then have that cliff advantage that you can attack down in. Obviously, all of this stuff is rocky ground, unbuildable terrain in the middle. We can even zoom in a little bit to show that. So I think it's pretty neat that you can do a push over here to the high ground and then maybe like leave a couple of units over here. And then that guarantees that in a horizontal spawn case, if I'm teal and you're doing that as blue, then I've got to go all the way around, right? just as a bit of an indication there. So this is a pretty cool looking map. I think it'll be, I don't know if it'll be, how many of the maps that I'm about to show here are going to end up being Empire class. That's the class that's like, yeah, we can put this directly into the map pool, but I can't immediately spot any flaws with it. I just want to see it played. So if you guys happen to be interested in trying out some new maps and you want to hop on to pre-release for the latest changes as well, you can do me a solid by testing out the latest changes and features, and you could do Biddy B a solid by testing out his map. Same goes for all the ones that we see here. Although I think this next one by the Shambler is not yet available. It is going to be a Twilight map. It doesn't have a name yet, but I did see that Top Ramen and the Shambler played a test game on it where Shambler was playing as Zerg and Top Ramen was playing as Terran. Over here, if we zoom on in, we can see that there is indeed a pair of bases here in the 12 o'clock and also the 6 o'clock position that are only accessible really by air. I think maybe it's possible to sneak in like a base over here at some point. I'm sure Shambler will block that. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, your efficient harvesting is definitely going to be to these neutral treasuries. That's the science facility graphic. You can indeed put some Taluses or other such flying workers onto here and harvest that way. Obviously, Protoss will have a field day with artisans on this map, I think, because this is actually a pretty safe base and kind of crucial that you can build over here because it means that you can put down like watchdogs or more likely, I guess, a couple of anti-air defenses or whatever as Protoss. You can put down some wardens or something, and that will help you harvest from here as well. I guess maybe a sleeper strategy could be if this cliff gets pushed out a little bit more, you could imagine putting your own town center over here like a treasury as Terran and then distance mining it a little bit instead of relying on this, and that would be a little bit safer. You could actually use this territory over here. I don't know, just like a pocket strat. Unlikely to be too impactful because it's a small number of resources. Maybe something that could be useful, although might bias it a little bit too heavily in favor of Protoss, is if these were neutral well bores or like some other higher tier version of a gas structure. It could even be refineries instead of wellborns like on Axiom. Just an idea there might be something that Shambler considers. He's really held on to this kind of thing as far as an element that he wants to include in his maps. It was on Cocytus for a while. I don't know if it's still on the latest version. It was on some of his most old maps where he really wanted to try to stress this feature as something that you can do in his maps in particular, using those flying workers. He definitely seems to think that it's like a cool thing to have in the game. We haven't seen it adopted, I think partially because it's so foreign to Brood War and StarCraft 2 players, but also partially because it is a little bit of a conceptual APM whenever you're talking about something that you're not familiar with, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that the ramps into the naturals are very wide, but to sort of consolidate that, you also have the ability to try to take this fast third if it's not horizontal spawn. And I think even if it is, you can kind of use like one gateway to block this from most units, or you can use like a stockade, anchor or whatever. You can block this path pretty easily. And especially I think in TVT, these bases could be taken and you could just have like a line of phalanxes or whatever, right? And just have it be death for anybody who goes over there, and then try to have like air defenses over here to stop the air rushes, right? If it gets to that point, maybe it'll still always be safer to take the double gas bases at 9 and 3 o'clock respectively. But I feel like these thirds are definitely takeable, particularly if it is cross spawn or vertical spawn. I think it's very possible. Vertical spawn is probably the safest. If you are cross spawn, you can easily attack into, say, this location from this position because you're in the bottom right, so you're naturally biased towards that. And you do have a nice middle in the map over here with a lot of open terrain, fully open ramps that you can jump into. So this map could end up having some very nice late game fights. I would love to see what ends up coming from that. But also it's worth noting that some of the maps, some of the ramps and bases and such are a little bit hard to defend, this being so open, having a little bit of nice build space. I did tell Shambler that it feels like the build space in the main is a little bit hard to use for ground production, because say you put like, 10 fulcrums here, they have to go over and around using this ramp, and then they've got to go down this way, which isn't really the zigzag so much as it's going to take a long time for them to navigate buildings off the rallies. So that's something that you got to watch out for. Impetus kind of struggles with this as well, a map by V7 that's currently in the Empire class pool. But its mains are also just very wide in general. However, this map doesn't have as droppable mains unless you are horizontal spawn, and even then you can put some defenses down, so it shouldn't be the end of the world. That is the Shambler's map. Shout out to him. I think that overall, I think it should be an interesting and fun map to play on. So another map that when he's ready to name it and upload it, I will be able to sync it over there pretty easily. Let's talk about Oblivion, a map by the Beaver99, who's returning to map making after a bit of a hiatus, you can say. His last map that I believe was featured was Infinite Velocity 2. Before that, it was XC2. And he has taken it upon himself to use a lot of custom tiles, which I love. But he has said before that he feels like his actual map layouts had problems with them that he couldn't realistically alter or change unless he massively updated the map layout themselves. And then it felt like, well, I've put all these custom tiles in, so what's the, there's kind of a problem with that. So he's taken it upon himself to try to scrap cobble together a couple of north-facing sandy sunken pit ramps. And I told him, and I still hold to this, that I'm pretty sure it will be possible for me to take what he's done here and turn it into an actual photoshopped ramp that I can use to add to the tile set, and then it'll have proper spacing and stuff. It looks like maybe we are missing crevices for this tile type as well, or he used the wrong ones. I'm not sure which. Either way, though, that's something that can also be rectified on the tile set level. This is a map that is still in development, but I figured I would include it here, mostly because, hey, dude, it's the Beaver. He's going to have a great time returning with a strong offer, I think. So we look over here. I don't know what these are. I assume they're stockades, just like the graphic. But if this is actually like a full wall situation, I wonder what he's planning with that. I mean, it's only on one side of the map, so maybe it's something that he was just testing for whatever purpose. I didn't read the notes, so I actually don't know. I know that these are town center markers. These are treasuries, so those will not be there for a long period of time. And you can see the anchors in the middle of the map. I think this one is a regular anchor, that like a trench foot or whatever we're going to call it, where it's like the bunker that can't lift off, and the rest are regular anchors for now, maybe just for visuals to indicate what's going on. That's going to be pretty interesting to try to hold the middle of the map with the first couple of units that you get. And eventually all of this terrain will be unbuildable, he said. So that's also pretty neat. But this does function as a height difference in Cosmonarchy as opposed to StarCraft 1, so that's something that's pretty cool. You can definitely imagine trying to hold all of these many ramps. That's going to be like a calling card for this particular map. I'm excited to see what happens with this one, man. I think that once people figure it out, and part of the visual palette right now is a little bland, but I'm sure that can be rectified with more tiles being added later. As I said, he's just sort of trying to figure out the layout of the map right now, and then he can worry about the custom tile placements later. And so, yeah, I'm very interested to see where this map goes. I think that's the best way for me to put it. I think it's really cool to see that Beaver is making a return to 1v1 map making, and I'm interested to see what happens with this one. It's a 2-spawn map, and we don't see too many of those anymore because everybody's all the rage on the 4 spawns, but it's worth noting. And speaking of 4 spawns, another map by BiddyB. This one is an attempted conversion of Dante's Peak. It's called Paradiso, and I think it's a pretty cool name, and it's a pretty cool idea to try to adapt old maps from ASL's gone, from yesteryear's ASLs into Cosmonarchy just to see how they play. I do think this would end up being a fairly experimental map at the end of the day because the spacing is completely different. And to fundamentally change that, you would need to expand the map size, which would break all the terrain, which means that it's basically not tenable to do that. I guess you could try to recreate the layout in a new map or something, right? But it is just a straight up conversion. You can see there's a bunch of busted tiles here that have not been processed yet. That's just because obviously he has not processed them yet. But that was something that he was mentioning as he was looking at it and saying, I wonder if it would be worth visiting and trying to put together some kind of change for that. And see if maybe we could carry it forward. Widen some of the ramps into the main, right? The ramp into the main would probably be a little bit wider for all of the players involved, and maybe the chokes would also lose the eggs, or maybe they'd keep them for easier walls. Who knows? But something worth pointing out. This ramp could be the same size, but more likely would be at least 2 wide instead of 1 wide. And then obviously you'd have these little spokes that are coming out here that would be unbuildable fully, and give you a little bit of cliff advantage there. Not sure if the mill would turn into a cliff advantage as well, like an upraised platform, or if it would just be a bridge, but it's pretty cool to look at. So, at the very least, there's that. Once the tiles get cleaned up, which is a mammoth task unto itself, it could be a pretty interesting thing to take a look at. And that kind of covers all of the maps that I had to show you guys today. So let's zoom back into the rest of the project, and let's switch over to the coffee questions. As mentioned in the show intro, if you want to support Cosmonarchy, you want to support what we're doing here, and eventually provide funding for the future of the genre after Cosmonarchy, our next games that we make, you can donate via Ko-fi, vis-a-vis the Ko-fi link in the bottom left, the Ko-fi link in the description. You can go there, you can pledge money monthly or one time, and we will thank you for it. We are going to start answering some donator questions. It's one of the many perks you get when you are a Ko-fi donor. But the other thing that's worth pointing out right now is that I will be starting on single-player campaign development pretty soon. And those streams will be private, mostly. Maybe some of them occasionally will be public, but those ones will indeed be privately circulated among the players, or the donors, I should say, because some of them don't play, but most of them do, who are interested in this sort of thing. And they will be able to tune in via Discord and also via a VOD that will be provided afterwards. But you will not be able to get it if you are not somebody who has access to that channel. So just keep that in mind, man. Now, let's start off by talking about the Shambler's question. He kicks us off here. It's kind of interesting because normally it's been Myrian who's been asking the first question, but he ends up asking the penultimate one, so join us for that later. The Shambler asks, considering how all the civilized races currently implemented in Cosmonarchy use penal soldiers in at least one branch of their military, how will the Askosi differ in their methods of recycling the scum of society? So it's kind of interesting that Shambler asks this question. His previous question for the last episode was about the Protoss and the crimes that their units have committed to end up being part of the sentenced, which would be units from the prostration stage and the rogue gallery. And I answered that question. There was a little bit of like, oh yeah, that's what it was, because I actually haven't thought about this in a while. But I did eventually remember a lot of those things. So it may surprise you, but the Askosi mostly use their criminal element as pilots for frontline reassembly vehicles. They're basically the units that are, once they take heavy damage, they are immediately deployed, like forcibly deployed. Because if you're going to be a criminal and then still find use somewhere, it has to be via piloting this thing and trying to be pretty good at it so you don't die. Because, the Askosi are pretty happy with, even if you die, that's not really a much skin off of their back. They might really have needed the asset in the moment, but lore-wise, if you think about who's piloting the thing, you're fine if that ends up being a suicide mission, right? They don't tend to use criminal elements to work through the biotic branch, which is essentially their infantry, because their infantry is responsible for a lot of scouting and really important intel. They need people that they can trust for that, even though it hurts to lose them, and even though that is the most large number by volume of units trained. So, mostly to answer the question, the Askosi are pretty discerning with their kin, but the criminal element, as small as it may be, because remember that they do have that cybernetic aspect to them where they can share each other's thoughts a little bit, and they don't have the same, you could call it hyper-religious culture they don't have the same honor culture of the Protoss. So their criminal element is actually a lot harder to come by overall. And so it makes a little bit of sense that, they wouldn't use them for things that really do rely on, you could call it like a high octane sort of high pace engagement. They're going to use criminal elements for things that they don't really need to trust the pilot on, where the machine does a lot of the work for them. And that will definitely describe the war machines that they deploy in the mid to late game and a little bit in the early game as well. So that is that. Hope that answers the question. We're moving on to Lucifirius' question. Lucifirius asks, what works of sci-fi and fantasy inspire you? Well, that's a lovely question. I have answered some questions that are kind of incidental to this. Like a lot of times you'll occasionally get questions asked about if you had to do a 40K story, what would you do? Or maybe then not that exact question, but questions like it, what would you do within 40K, or what would you do within Star Wars, or, stuff like this. And it's incidentally related to, obviously I must have some familiarity with them, which means maybe I did indeed get inspired by them. And there's some drawing comparisons to other media and stuff. But I will say that I think I was massively inspired by Dune for the creation of the Pangea setting, which is at least that was for the longest time. We're not 100% sure. I have to ask Vic what he wants to do, because we decided to give Vic the sort of keys to the kingdom when it comes to deciding the direction of our next game after Cosmonarchy. And so I'm not 100% sure what he's going to be going for. But Pangea was the planned game that we do after Cosmonarchy. So maybe that'll still be the case. We'll see what he wants to do. But when it comes to Pangea, I was definitely inspired by Frank Herbert's Dune books, the 6 books that he wrote specifically. I feel like they tell a very interesting tale about the adaptability of humans, the attempts at doing things, at always controlling things, and how you inevitably create a bigger monster when you're trying to control an existing one and use it to your advantage, or react to it in a way that will still leave you with some kind of advantage. I think there's a lot of interesting symbology to look at that, and it's pretty cool to imagine what comes next for all of those things. So that's a big deal. For sure gave me some thoughts about also like analog technology that would still find spacefaring and stuff where the humans become the computers. It's kind of interesting, right, to think about. Even though towards the end they kind of just said, yeah, they still made computers anyway, which, okay, well, I mean, it makes sense that they would eventually violate that doctrine, but, it maybe took away a little bit of the luster that was there for sort of having it be unspoiled, right? Not despoiled by technology of that sort, but still having the human be the computer. I think that's like a really interesting philosophical point to think about, and also world building point to consider. I think Frank Herbert's world building is pretty damn good, all in all. Happy about the way that it was also presented as well. I think he gave me a lot of food for thought about how to present that sort of thing. I don't think at any point you feel like Frank Herbert's writing, he's waffling an excuse for how something works. I'm sure there's like some things you could really pick apart if you got super detailed. But for me, it feels like he knows all of the things that you need to know to make authoritative claims about the setting without communicating all of those things and flexing that he knows all of those things about his own setting. Like, of course you should know those things about your own setting. So that's definitely a thing that I believe, but you also need to be conscious of like having that knowledge, and being confident in that knowledge means that you will be able to make, you'll be able to write plot points and character beats that really do make sense to a lot of people within the setting that have that verisimilitude without info dumping all of the details. I think that's a really big thing that I've always stressed, and to see that happen in Frank Herbert's work was like a reinforcement of that kind of the importance of that sort of thing, because I definitely connected a lot with that. So that was a big deal for me. As far as fantasy goes, everybody and their mother's already watched the Lord of the Rings movies. I have not read the Lord of the Rings books. I know that Tolkien's writing style is very different from Frank Herbert's, so it's kind of interesting. It would probably be interesting to compare and contrast them. But I will say that I was inspired by how unabashed the representation of the different species within the Middle Earth sort of stories were all about. Like, Lord of the Rings had orcs and urukai and stuff like that are just like unabashedly bloodthirsty. They obviously had the trolls and stuff too, and whatnot. And it was just interesting to see that sort of style, right? It was interesting to have that be the case, and very maybe in some ways like very black and white. I know Tolkien doesn't really like the idea of symbology in general. He kind of likes to have the stories be very straightforward, in a sense that there's like deeper meaning or different ideas you can take from them, and certainly different inspirations. But it was made to be fiction, as opposed to being fiction that is made to tell a story or to connect a theme or to have something greater to it. And I can respect that as well. And I know that was something that was embedded within the work. And I think it did also get translated over through the movie as well. I don't know. I guess that on the world building note, there's not that many fantasy environments that I have that are memorable to me. As a kid, I read a lot of the Sword of Truth series by I know Richard Rahl let's look this up. The Sword of Truth. I know Richard Rahl is the character name, but I don't know who authored it. Terry Goodkind. So that's and maybe it's Goodkind. Who the hell knows how to pronounce these people's names? But Terry has written a lot of books. Apparently, there's 12 of them, by the way. And I've read at least 9 as a kid. I remember not understanding what the sex scenes were all about because I was a kid. And there's there's like some of them in there. It's not like a very lusty book or anything. It's more about like grand scale armies and like, political intrigues and stuff like that. And also like a coming of age story in some ways, although the main character is already in his late 20s, early 30s when the story starts, but there's still an element of a call to adventure and whatnot. So that was kind of interesting. I liked the character dialogue and stuff, but again, I was basically a kid. I was like early teen when I was reading this, or like early, maybe tween, like 12 or whatever, by the way, when I was reading the series for the first time. So I have no idea if it would hold up now. But I think I did take the idea of like magic as a resource as opposed to just a thing that occurs. That is at play in that. And there's even like a subplot or maybe a primary plot for like, there was like some generic term that I remember, like something like Old Empire or something, where they were moving in from different part of the realm, and they were specifically trying to wage war on magic, which I thought was kind of interesting. And we'll see. We'll see if maybe I go back and read that and have different thoughts. But that's something that I think is interesting to think about. Is like doing something different with a core identity or core element or component of a genre. Like magic is a very core component of the fantasy genre, and computers are a very core component of sci-fi. So what a through line that I'm figuring out here is that it's interesting to play around with those core components in novel ways, which is kind of like the riffing that I've sometimes done in my own work. So I'd say that also inspires me. Thanks for the question, Lucy. It was cool to answer. We're going to answer Myrian's question next. Of course, I did mention that he asked the penultimate question. That means we have 4 in total, and he's the third, so 3, dude. Myrian asks, could you discuss likely alliances between regencies in Xibalba or factions in Cosmonarchy, or perhaps peaceful relations in general in Xibalba? And so I originally misread this as unlikely alliances, and I was going to say, I feel like I answered this question a while ago, but no, I have not really talked about likely ones, so let's open up the Regencies tab again, and I suppose this means I'll have to, I guess I leave a link to Xibalba in all of these anyway, so there you go, you'll be able to do it. For those who don't know, though, Xibalba is my, and yes, I'm not pronouncing it Xibalba on purpose. I know, Xibalba is different. Xibalba is a setting, a sci-fi setting that I have made, and it has a lot of different alien species in it, and 20 controllable regencies for the purposes of like an RTS game with different tech trees, or maybe a shooter game with different factions or whatever. It's basically like everything you could want from a game setting for sci-fi. That's basically what Xibalba is all about. So very cosmic. There are no humans in it. The most human-like hominids are like the Ansifi or the Retans, which are a subgroup of the Emberseat. So there's like a bunch of different things, but none of them are really that humanoid at the end of the day in terms of like, you wouldn't really look at them and think, oh, that's a human. No, they'd be pretty obviously not human. It's just, that's the closest thing you got. So if we look at the Regency listing, there's some things that are definitely, I would say, likely alliances or alliances that have been made in the past. Psychora with Githrovan. Githrovan recognize the Psychora as intruders to their universe, but some among them believe that the extra dimensions are also part of the universe, and there's some debate about whether or not they should be allied together, since Githrovans are trying to establish universal peace within the dimensions that they can comprehend. There's some debate about whether or not the Psychora should be friend or foe. But ultimately, there have been many alliances where the Psychora are, despite their intrusions, trying to battle common enemies of the Githrovans and that particular group of Psychora, like that particular heart world of Psychora. So when we think about the Githrovan sort of peacekeeping efforts, you are going to occasionally see them ally, just because it makes sense, because oftentimes the Psychora do battle with the Rhazellium or the Gedimemter, and those are the kinds of things that the Githrovan are going to bristle at. Obviously, the Githrovan will ally with anybody against the Solar Throne. That's pretty obvious, generally speaking. But the Psychora are common allies in many respects, based on the fact that the Psychora are often intruding in like the outer lands, which are a little bit more wild. Like the outer worlds of individual sectors are often the ones that you're going to see Psychora intrude in. Just like Dad intruded on my podcast recording. Come on, cops, what are you doing? So the Githrovan and the Psychora, basically, like the Githrovans are going to police those outer worlds when they can, and those sort of wasteland areas of space are exactly where you would see Psychora show up. And that's also happens to be like the roving grounds of a lot of Rhazellium, the roving grounds of a lot of Rune or Gedimemter, and also the Nada Asatha, which are often enemies of the Githrovan because they don't want peace. We'll put it to you that way. Another common alliance is, even though the first time you'll play as Ansifi in the currently planned content for Xibalba is actually against Keltar interlopers, actually, the Ansifi do ally with the Keltar somewhat often. Keltar and Githrovans are known to ally since they both have like a appreciation for honor and among warriors. The Emberseat will ally with the Ansifi as hiring them out as mercenaries. The Ansifi are most commonly a mercenary they are among the factions or regencies in the game that have been hired out as mercenary fleets. The Ansifi are the most common. That doesn't mean that Ansifi are the majority of Ansifi are mercenaries themselves. There's a lot more Ansifi in like the different republics and stuff than there are in these mercenary fleets. But the most common mercenaries are Ansifi. And the Mackerel Das are also often finding themselves dominating the lower, the lesser regencies, right? And so the Ember Seed are chief among them. I don't know if you'd call that an alliance as much as a servitude or annexation, but you will sometimes see Mackerel Das and Ember Seed fight alongside each other, so to speak. Another one that might be interesting is the Oros and the Rhazellium. Remember, the Oros have electrokinesis, and the Rhazellium are robotic, right? They are, they have that command structure going on, which we'll talk about in the next question, as well as, of course, the fact that the Solar Throne, you might think the Oros would try to occasionally interlope in, but the Solar Throne are the ones to dominate most people. So you're not going to see the Oros with the Solar Throne too often. But the Oros with the Rhazellium, yeah, that's a fairly common pairing. And I'm looking through the rest of the list. I think Nadarasatha... I think it's interesting that Nadarasatha would probably end up going alongside the Rune, but not for the reason you think. Unlike the other regencies that sometimes try to like dupe the Rune into servitude or into like a temporary alliance of convenience, the Rune actually really are quite terrified of the Nadarasatha. So they will tend to capitulate to them in negotiations. And the reason for that has never really been made clear, but that is a relation that exists within the regencies. And then I don't know if the Kolopoazos counts as like a common alliance really with anything, but they have been known to try to trifle all of the different regencies now and again as allies and as enemies. So you will absolutely see that. For the Cosmonarchy answer to this question, because we have factions as like sub-factions or whatever for the different lore things, and they also have like some tech tree changes. You don't want to get access to them in competitive, but the competitive tech trees are like the most common one. So the Orion Imperium is the competitive Terran tech tree, the Divine Primacy is the competitive Protoss tech tree, and the Ataltrith Tendril is the competitive Zerg tech tree. So of course you play as those in the tutorial, and you play against those in the tutorial as well. So the reason why I'm bringing all of that up is because there was the ask about, would there be alliances in between the factions? Generally, the factions are skeptical, if not directly at war with each other. There are some regionalities to that for the Terrans, where, not all Futurist Federation forces attack all Orion Imperium forces on site. The Hikatan Coalition is actually pretty friendly with most of the non-Imperium forces, and they have some element of like a ceasefire generally active with the Imperium, but that has been known to go sideways if they ever happen to try to occupy similar territories. And of course, the Nidus Trinity is hostile to, all of the existing Terran forces are hostile to the Nidus Trinity, it's best to say. And upstart just is like a catch-all term for like anybody that's like a local planetary principality or something, where they don't have the ability to rely on another faction for sponsoring them, so to speak. So they use like basically older technology and retrofitted technology. The factions for the Protoss, on the other hand, it's definitely worth taking a look at those ones. I think the Order of the Order of the Sacred Saber is often allied with the Divine Primacy. They have pretty friendly relations with everybody but the including the Starbound, actually, but not including the Calendric Knights, who view them as weaklings, for more or less, or somewhat cowardly, hiding behind machines and such. The reason why the Starbound and the Sacred Saber get along is, again, the Sacred Saber is about preserving Protoss lives no matter what happens to them. So they don't make as many use of Sentenced, for example. Like, they'll probably have a factional Vagrant replacement. And they do absolutely think that, like, even if they're the Protoss is a criminal or an exile, it's better that they live and eventually attempt to atone for their sins or their crimes than die at the hands of some, frontline onslaught or whatever. And so again, the Sacred Saber is a lot more permissive in that particular sense. But that doesn't mean that they have a lot of criminals. It just means that they're a little bit more like the Protoss equivalent of the Bleeding Heart, I suppose. But you don't expect them to then have like a lot of rampant crime or anything. They're just a little bit more. I guess they're more about rehabilitation than the other leading regencies, factions, the Calendric Knights and the Divine Primacy. So that is worth pointing out. On the Zerg side, the Tendrils can have a sort of continuum with each other. So they have been known to collaborate or operate in the same area, but they've also been known to fight, and the reasons for it are never really clear to the other races. So I can't really say too much about that. And as far as the Askosi are concerned, it may interest people to know that the Askosi themselves have some factions. The melee one, the tech tree for the melee guys, is the Inoa Scatterguard. And the again, remember that they have been the victims of a civil war that has claimed their entire home sector. That it was essentially blown up their home planet and supernovaed their sun. So there's not really much left over there besides dust and echoes, to quote Halo. So it's worth pointing out that the Askosi are definitely in a different situation. They are not really too common to... you're not going to find Askosi alliances across the factions very commonly. And generally speaking, when they encounter one of the other factions, they're going to be very... on edge. That doesn't mean that they always attack. It just means that sort of like the ceasefires or whatever that are very trepidatious over in the Terran arsenal between like the Hecatons and the Imperial forces. It's kind of the same deal for the Askosi. So worth pointing out there. And that is my answer to your question. You can ask about peaceful relations if you want more details, I guess. I think I covered that, but feel free to re-up that or think of a different one for the next episode. As always, for anybody who is answering these or asking these questions, I make the next thread usually within a day of releasing the previous episode, so you can always check Discord for that. I will ping you based on your coffee question or coffee king role, so check that out as well. All right, we are jumping into the final question of this episode. It's Three Crows, and he's asking about the Rhazellium command structure, as I mentioned before. Three Crow asks, can you go into some detail about how the Rhazellium hierarchy of command works, and if fringe/expanding Rhazellium actually communicate with the original or longest existing Rhazellium? Bonus points if you could discuss what the highest forms of Rhazellium beings are like. So I was a little bit torn how to make the Rhazellium work when it comes to their overall construction and the later stages of the game, which, by the way, for those who don't know, it's like when it comes to the late stage stuff, it's worth pointing out that the, I'm trying to build this setting in a world. Rhazellium are from Xibalba, for anybody who doesn't know. I'm trying to build this setting specifically for the idea that you're going to be building out a game world, right? It's not meant to first be like lore accurate, whatever that means, or like, you want to have both. You want to have verisimilitude, you want to have things that make sense there, but you also want to have enough leeway to create a workable situation for the, for a game, for building a game out, right? So I think it's definitely worth pointing that out, because otherwise you might be in an awkward position. Excuse me. So it's worth pointing out for the Rhazellium that, they've got the three branches that I've set up for them. They've got the perpetual branch, the reassembling branch, and the designed branch. And that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on there, with the perpetual branch being the ones that self-replicate, the reassembling ones being the ones that can repair themselves, and the designed ones being the ones that don't seem to need those behaviors because they are of supreme power and like high efficacy themselves. I do talk about in the description on the website the Cerasil, which are control nodes, essentially. These are... I was originally thinking that these would maybe be units or something, but I think the approach I would take now is to actually make them, expensive node like tech structures, basically. And the reason why it would be, you'd have those, maybe they would tech up similar to Zerg, where they have like the one structure, but it can be upgraded into a new version. And that would basically be like, unfurling the next evolution of the next update to the Rhazellium, for lack of a better term. So when the Rhazellium are trying to scale themselves up, like, you have to think about how it's been talked about, the singularity, right? Like, AI will make itself better, have rapid auto improvement, right? That's sort of the idea, auto development, but at a very rapid rate. That's the idea behind the singularity for us in the contemporary age. Now, when it comes to the Rhazellium, they kind of have the same thing going on, where the Cerasil are constantly essentially evolving and splintering their current deployment off from the main sort of host and feeding that information back to the host. But it's like it's like going down a very, very long code path where you start off at the main function in your program and you call a subfunction, and that subfunction calls a subfunction, and it's like, many branching paths down the way. That's basically how the Serasil are trying to customize their detachment. And that doesn't mean that they can't communicate back to the main host or to the sort of main function, right? Like oftentimes that will happen in programming is you'll call some functions within main and eventually they'll return values or they'll do things that touch other things that need to be done in a certain sequence for the rest of the functions to work. All of this stuff I think makes some sense when you think about that from the programming standpoint. That's just an analogy that came to mind off the dome. And I think that the fact that the Serasil will attempt to tailor their functionality based on the enemy that they see and the enemies that they're encountering, the combat situation that is required, that is essentially what the Serasil are all about. So sort of like how the Zerg cells in Cosmonarchy are constantly feeding information back to the organ, and then the organ is making strategic choices based on that feedback, right? It's all like it's supposed to be one biological entity in some ways. You can conceptualize it as every Zerg unit is a cell and every structure is a tissue, and all of them are feeding information back to the brain, and the brain, which is the organ, is the organ is the whole thing. There's the nerve part, which is sort of maybe like the player, if you will. Then there's the cells and the tissues that are doing the heavy lifting biologically, but the nerves are issuing commands to those cells and tissues for them to do certain things. That's kind of what's going on with the Rhazellium, where you've got these Serasil, which are the highest forms of, at least when it comes to the like the strategic updates, right? Not necessarily in terms of individual units, right? These things are constantly like updating the existing Rhazellium, and so you will have so many different permutations based on having so many different units and the order in which you've got those units and all this other stuff that you need to start fresh at the start of each battle, and you might load like a profile to think about like, okay, in the past I've done this. In the past the Rhazellium have dealt with this threat this way. That would be information that would be communicated to you by the main. But at the end of the day, right, like you still need to actually carry that function out and see if it's working properly, and then adapt if it's not. And so that's what the Serasil provide. The more you deploy, the more you evolve down that path, the higher your tech will go. So maybe there's an argument to try to do like tech-based progression, but I'm not so sure that I'm going to do that at the end of the day. Then also it's worth noting that the Rhazellium are planned to have structure-based construction, where a structure builds another structure, so on and so forth. So I'm not sure about how that'll end up in practice. Maybe that won't be it in practice, but they did have that tiered structure tech progression, right? Similar to Zerg, where you upgrade the structure into different variants. So it's and maybe it's one of those things where you can rebuild the Serasil after, and it will automatically be assembling back to maybe the time cost will be there, but the resource cost won't, where it will regrow back to the next version, right? It could even end up being something that just occurred to me is that maybe maybe you could even have the tech structure automatically upgrade itself after a certain point, and you maybe start with it. So that this could be kind of interesting, where it's like, or maybe you don't start with it. Maybe you still choose when to start it. But like as soon as you start it, it's like, okay, you finish it in say 30 seconds or 60 seconds or whatever, and that unlocks like the next tier. But then like 5 minutes later, it will automatically unlock the next tier. And maybe you can choose to spend money to accelerate that or something like that. That could be an interesting permutation. And anyway, that would be kind of neat to think about, because it would basically be like, you can choose to accelerate it with resources, or it can just passively harvest data using the Rhazellium drones, and then it would go from there. So eventually upgrading to the next tier of tech when it has gathered enough data in that respect. That can be kind of interesting to me to explore. But yeah, the hierarchy of command is pretty similar to the Zerg in that respect, where you do have the various drones reporting data, gathering data, reporting back to the main host, and the main host gives you this like initial battle plan to the Serasils, which carry it out and evolve it and upgrade it or change it over time to adapt to the current situation. And also that feed that data back in for future uses. after the fact. So that is the way that the Rhazellium hierarchy of command works. The bonus points of highest forms of Rhazellium beings, I mean, they're all automata. Their engineers are long since expired by now, so the organics that gave birth to them, so to speak, have been reassembled already, recycled already, many eons ago. So you can't really say beings, but if you're just talking about like individual units or whatever, there's definitely going to be some units that can recycle en masse. And like essentially you can think of like the end stage of the perpetual branch as like a nanoswarm type thing. I haven't decided on the specifics, obviously, but I'm definitely thinking that like it would be a lot of small units that would sort of maybe behave like the brood spawn in Zerg, but when they attack, maybe they couldn't be like individually targeted, and they only stay alive if they are actively dealing damage to something. That could be kind of interesting. They'd probably still be like crowd controllable, but you wouldn't automatically acquire them as a target, right? I think stuff like that is pretty neat. That's definitely one thing that comes to mind. For the others, I haven't really decided yet. In fact, I think that the secondary branch of reassembling might end up being like more of a niche that's filled by many of them, and then we'll need a second idea for the second branch. The designed, though, they're like very powerful, but also very specialized, right? They're simulants with a special purpose. And so I think you're generally going to see the Cerasil provide a lot of value for that specifically, where they're trying to equip them with a certain thing. And maybe I'm not against this entirely, although I feel like it adds a computational explosion of different things. But it could be that like the more you engage with a very specific enemy regency, that actually informs the kind of simulants from the designed branch that you get access to first. That could be kind of interesting to think about, where it's like, there's certain regencies or maybe certain kinds of units that, like, say you're getting attacked by a lot of siege weaponry, then when you tech up next, and maybe you could even just specify this in the Cerasil, that like, maybe that's the better way to do it because it's still player choice based, that maybe you could equip yourself with like, you take your Cerasil and you would specify like, give me access to these 4 units from the designed branch when you tech up. And then that would effectively provide you with those 4 units when it techs up, and you could change that at any point until it actually techs up. And that could be really interesting to think about. So that's something that just occurred to me that I think is worth exploring as a concept. So there you go, 3Crow. Instead of the bonus points you asked for, I did talk about the nanoswarm, but I also think it's bonus points of a different kind. I gave you a different idea of how their tech would, scale up, so to speak, and how you'd get access to those supreme highest forms of Rhazellium entities. So, pretty cool shit. That brings us to the show close. It's been almost 2 hours. I love doing these podcasts. I love making Cosmonarchy content and building better improvements to the game. And I just love making cool RTS stuff. So if you want to join us for more cool RTS stuff, you know where to go. That coffee link, which I will now hide. And of course, you can also just join our Discord server if you're not there already. Shout out to all the homies who have provided some funds, who have jumped in and played the tournaments and provided fodder for daily casts, which will continue. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. You know the drill, and we'll see you guys very soon. GG.